super grateful to be here with you today. We are going to have a conversation among friends on politics and citizenship. And I just want to make super clear that we're not going to have a debate. This is my normal tone of voice. I'm not going to scream or anything like that. So if this makes you think I'm in the wrong workshop, don't feel bad about leaving. But if you feel like your body relaxed by me saying that just now, great, you're in the right spot. We're going to go, they have told us, till 4:15, and then there's a little break. We're going to stick around. We're not going to bolt. So if you want to ask us questions after, but we're all long talkers, so we just decided we're not going to try to make room for your questions in our hour, so we have time to actually talk. But we would be happy to spend more time with you and answer questions. Even in the reception tonight, you can just come up and pick us out of the crowd. So the other thing that's happening is we know each other fairly well. And so even though I'm talking first, I'm going to prompt with questions that we have. But I'm also, Vince was joking that I get to moderate myself. I'm not actually like the moderator for this conversation. But we're just going to take turns kind of answering some of these questions. So the first thing I'm going to have us do is introduce yourself. Say a little bit about yourself, what you've done, like why you're in this room talking about politics and citizenship, and if you can describe any connections you have to the CCO. And Jim, why don't you start?
James Skillen. I directed the Center for Public Justice for 30 years before Stephanie took over, and I was a prof in college for 10 years before that, so I've been interested in the nature of how Christians ought to be looking at the world and thinking about it. I came to politics very late because I had no interest in it until graduate school. But yeah, that's what I've been doing. Now I'm enjoying retirement and seeing the grandkids grow up, so that's fun.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, just go. Oh,
Yeah, go
all
ahead.
right. I'm Vince Bacote. I teach theology and direct the Center for Applied Christian Ethics at Wheaton College, the Wheaton College in Illinois, not the one closer here in Massachusetts. And I was on the board of CPJ for 6 years, and now I'm a fellow of CPJ. I knew of CPJ before I became on the board. I met Jim in the late 90s at the Princeton Kuiper Conference. And so I'm a big fan of CPJ, and I've been at a number of Jubilee conferences. I don't know the number. I'll have to go back and look at my CV and find out. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
But Stephanie, I had one more thing to say. I came to fight. I'm not going to I'm not going to put up with that mild stuff you're doing. We got to solve things. There's a war going on out there. And you promised me I'd have 15 minutes to say something.
To fight, yes. So I'm Stephanie Summers. I'm the CEO of the Center for Public Justice. Those of you who are not familiar with our work, we are an independent, not partisan, Christian civic education and public policy organization. We're based outside Washington, D.C. And my connection to the CCO is kind of extensive. I came to Christ through the ministry of CCO staff. I came to understand this big four-part story through the CCO's ministry. That's actually the Christianity that I was formed in, and so has been the set of lenses that I've looked through for a long time. I met James Skillen when I was 19 at the Jubilee Conference, and he rocked my world because it was the first time I heard a Christian talk about what it meant to be a citizen as Christian, and I had never thought about that set of responsibilities as a Christian person. And that really shaped me. I went up to Jim, and I'm sure I asked a bunch. I remember just talking a lot. I was like in fangirl mode, and I was like, blah, 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 blah. And Jim's response was, do you like to read? I was like, I do. And so we were off to the races. I worked for CCO for quite a long time, for 12 years, and they sent me to Washington, D.C., and we reconnected in the 2000s. And I was the annoying person who kept trying to figure out strategies for how CPJ could reach young adults. And you know, when you hang around CPJ, it's an organization that invites your comment, but also then asks you to actually do the work. And so, you know, in God's funny story, I ended up being invited to serve after Jim's retirement into CPJ. So I'm grateful for that. All right, friends. I wonder if we could start and go Jim, Vince, me. At the question of why Christians should care about politics and citizenship, and maybe share the story of how you came to care about it yourself.
Well, what I want to do is talk about public justice, the name of the Center for Public Justice. So what does that mean? What is it? I got to this in a kind of roundabout way because I was a philosophy major in college and then did seminary and then did some more philosophy study in the Netherlands. I had no interest in politics during all that time. But then through a whole bunch of circumstances came to have to study it, study philosophy of law and then politics, and then started working with a group that was going to start what became the Center for Public Justice. That was way back in the 70s. And that was the first time when involved with the group. I had been teaching things, I'd been thinking about it, wanting people to think wisely about political life. But it was the first time I thought myself, I'm a citizen. What does it mean to be a citizen in the sense of a personal responsibility? So maybe that's what you caught from me because I'd been through it. But public justice we were talking about is you could say the norm, the standard by which we ought to be thinking about what a political order ought to be, a political community of citizens and government. But what I learned over time, both from study but also from the experience, is that one of the fundamental problems we have as Americans, especially American Protestants, is that we are the heirs of St. Augustine and John Locke. Now, you don't need to know anything about that, except that Augustine is the one who argued that God gave government because of sin. We are not naturally political creatures. We aren't made for political life. It's because of sin that God brought about somebody to punish evildoers and try to protect the innocent. John Locke, in a more secular way, secularizing way, he was a liberal Christian, you might say, in the 17th century, leading into one of the more influential figures in American politics, made a similar argument, but not in terms of God ordaining government, but that free individuals who begin to mix their labors with the soil and with animals and so forth start to accumulate property. And they find that when somebody's stealing their apples and other guys shooting their sheep and so on and so forth, that they would give up a little of their sovereignty as individuals and create an umpire who would punish evildoers and try to protect the innocent. But the primary thing is to protect life, liberty, and property. That's turned into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But then if you think of it that way, it's very, very difficult to think of a vocation in political life. It's very difficult for most people even to think of Christians that their citizenship means anything. Political life is about getting what we want. It's about the government protecting my life and property. What really matters is myself and what I'm doing and what I own and what I want to do. Government's a nuisance. At the very libertarian end of that theme, government should be doing nothing more than police work and military to protect life and property. Anything else is a waste of our tax money. Anti-taxation, all those kind of things are part of it. There can be other dimensions to it. But what I also then found out in conversation with others and reading some other things is that that's a false picture of the biblical story. That we were made to be people who would form political communities, not just umpires to protect our lives and property, but a political community. We would have civic caps on in addition to our family hats and our work hats and other things. Now, to explain that biblically in any detail, I need 3 more hours, and Stephanie said she wouldn't give it to me. But here's the simplest way that I found to do it. If government was given because of sin, then you would imagine, and maybe even hope for, that after Christ has put down all death and sin, and that's all buried, we would have no more need for government. It's just a for now protective thing. But this is where I would urge you to read Revelation 21. I think somebody already this afternoon referred to Revelation. There's a lot of stuff in Isaiah and elsewhere that can feed back. But okay, picture yourself. Here's the resurrection, the gathering in of the saints to be in the dwelling with God. And there's going to be the great wedding affair. There's going to be the great banquet feast. A lot of us disciples are going to want to keep studying with Rabbi Jesus and learn more. There's going to be all kinds of things that will have to do with the fairs that we know and love. Gardening, and harvesting, and your vocation. But lo and behold, Revelation 21 is about a kingdom being fulfilled. It's about you maybe have not thought of the oddness and weirdness of the mixed metaphor of the city of Jerusalem coming down as a bride for her husband. Now, the most intimate relationship of marriage is combined with this picture of a New Jerusalem. Jerusalem's a city. And in fact, Christ is the king. He's the Lord in the middle. Kings are bringing their glories in. Now, there's no point in having a government and a king and a city and a political order when there's no need for retribution, for retributive justice, is there? Well, it's the other way around. There will be no retributive justice needed when the glory is fulfilled. We won't need police and cops and military. But we're going to have a public order, a political order. And if I bring it up to date now, if you think about it, and I can only encourage you to think about it, most of what governments do is not retributive justice, meaning police and courts and military. It's paving roads. It's making sure there's water and sewage systems functioning. It's about education, encouraging it. It's all kinds of things. I have no idea what the total percentage of funding is, because you've got local and state and federal levels. But that's the nurturing, that's the thing. So just try to imagine now driving to work or running your operation or paying somebody, and there be no public order, no public facilitation, no commons. See, that's the biggest thing. So what I would say, building on that, is simply to say the Center for Public Justice is a beginning, it's a spark to say we as Christians need to work together in community in order to begin to develop an approach to political life that does a couple things that we just don't do, and that's why it's foreign. I often thought about the work in the center in Washington. It was a kind of un-American activity because we wanted to do things like, I talk to people about justice. Oh, that's nice, you're for that. I like to sail, or it's a nice hobby that you have there. But when you have the kind of government attitude toward government that's the liberal tradition, and by that I mean liberal conservative, it always starts with the autonomy of the person as first. When you have that, what you end up with is people lobbying for their interests. And of course, lobbying now, for all kinds of reasons, is the dominant way members of Congress are influenced. The people in separate districts where they're elected have relatively little power just by letter writing and so forth. Why are the lobbyists there? Well, that has to do with a whole lot of the system. But that's what it is. And what we need to do is the other thing about it is that we see ourselves as individuals, and we feel like we ought to vote, at least be a citizen. So a month before the election, November 5, people want to know, who should I vote for? Or they already knew that from the beginning. They are dyed in the wool, Republican or Democrat, whatever their ideology is, and I don't know what yours is. But you vote, but in many ways, we're not shaping anything. It's like deciding that you want to go out to a certain kind of restaurant, a bunch of you, And all you can do is select from it. And if the Korean restaurant you really wanted isn't there, well, tough luck. But we're saying there needs to be a way that we start to think communally about a community, political community. That's the best word. Our republic should be a political community, not just a place where individuals who want to have their lives, liberty, and right to work are there. It's one that's about seeing that the commons does justice to everybody that's a citizen. Government isn't everything. Public justice is not the only kind of justice that needs done. We need to do justice in our families, in our homes, and in our business enterprises, but the community that needs to be shaped so that we begin to understand what it means that we are citizens in law. In other words, the kind of relationship we have with our neighbors as citizens is they're citizens in law. We won't marry them, we're not going to have coffee with them, 99.999% of them, but we are all under the same legal system, and what it ought to do is to do justice. And that's where you're addressing not only the huge racist problem and the gun problem and the environment problems and distance between rich and poor. Those are public order things in many, many ways. And the government should be addressing them, and we need to think about it. So what I'm hoping for the Center for Public Justice, and I suspect that my colleague here, Stephanie, would say the same, what this will spark, we need eventually to have the Center for Public Justice have special people working on every policy area that's needed. That we would be training and helping people come to see that they should be members of Congress or state legislators or whatever legislatures. So that's what I hope will happen and grow out of this, and that's the way I think we as Christians can see that we have by nature, by our very creatureliness. So government doesn't begin with the fall, it begins with creation. It's fulfilled not by when it's not necessary anymore because there's no more death and sin around, but it's fulfilled when Christ the King is glorified, sitting on the throne, and we are celebrating and serving as citizens in that kingdom, as well as all the other things that will be done.
Thank you. Want to jump in?
Sure. How did I become interested in this? I think the best way to put it is to say, I don't remember not being interested in it. It's more, not because I'm like wanting to be a policy wonk or something like that, but when I think about taking my faith seriously as a Christian and then thinking about life beyond Sunday or life outside the church, it always seemed to me like there ought to be a kind of natural connection between those things rather than a separation between those things. But as we even heard upstairs earlier, my formation spiritually also included this sense that there's kind of your sacred world or your spiritual type things, and there's everything else. I mean, be a nice person in those things, but don't invest too much in those things. But it didn't make any sense to me that those things should have this kind of wall between them. And so for me, it was really a matter of looking for a biblical and theological argument for why we ought to why we ought to care, because it was functioning as a kind of spiritual intuition for me that Christians should care about life outside of the church. So and that includes political life. And so for me, the way that I kind of got there was by my engagement with the neo-Calvinist tradition and reading Abraham Kuyper, which was great for me and also challenging for me in other ways. That's a different topic, but we can talk about that one later if you want. But the important thing for me was finding theological language that said that it was proper for Christians to care about things besides spiritual things. Or another way to put it is to say that spiritual things were not exclusive to what you do in the context of Sunday morning worship. And so for me, what that really was understanding how in our doctrine of creation, like the fourth story that we heard upstairs, how that really sets the stage for us to be people that are involved. So, Jim just said, politics begins with creation. It doesn't happen because the fall came in and created a crisis in creation. And the way you can think about that is, if there were no fall, what would human social life be like? Would everybody just be, hey, we're just kind of like having, we're good at agriculture and animal husbandry and, stuff just happens. And we have something like a social life, but that also just happens. And my point being is that, well, even if you said that, at some point you're going to have to ask questions like, all right, so how are people managing their life together? How are they going to go about and do that? At some point, people are going to have to develop something where they do things beyond their family unit and they sort through their life together. And, so Jim mentioned, for example, politics having things to do with building roads. Well, who's going to decide who builds the roads? Who's going to decide how you pay for the roads? All of those types of things are things that would happen even if you did not have a fall. So you would still have this political community that needs to sort out its management of life together. So politics is not something that we should ever really be thinking about avoiding. A lot of times I think people have this hesitancy, we'll call it, about politics because they think about how it's poorly done. But it's very interesting to consider this question. Are you thinking about how it's poorly done because you only think it can be poorly done? Is it possible for it to be done in another way? And another way to think about that is to say, okay, let's not talk about politics. Let's talk about something you care about that other people might not like, but you care about it. And you would probably say about that thing, well, not everything in this domain is so dark and horrible. The way I'm doing it isn't so dark and horrible. So actually there's versions of this that are actually okay. Well, it's the same thing with politics, right? But so often there's this, we'll call it a reputation management problem that the political world has, that people think is telling you about what is essential to political life. And so I think a question to be willing to ask is, well, is it essential to political life to always be something that is guaranteed to be only about having bad, a public relations problem? And I think being willing to ask that question can help us get to a place of understanding that, political life is something that we should care about. So that's part of really how kind of got into and started to think about it. Here's something I'd ask all of you to think about. Think about Christians that you know, that are not people that you expect to come to a conference like Jubilee, but you know them. And if you can do this these days, very easy, just go create some jot form or some poll or whatever, and ask all the Christians you know why Christians should care about politics. And then see what kind of answers you get. And here is the wager that I would make. In these days of all this betting, sports betting and stuff, I'm not one of those people. But if I were a betting man, my wager would be that most of them might tell you that there's some reason that Christians should do it, but it would not come out of what Christians believe. There wouldn't be something out of what they believe as Christians that tells them why this is something they should care about. They might tell you that they should be nice people in politics, or they might say we need to do something evangelistic, or maybe there's some way that certainly some people had this idea that their view of the nation is perhaps that it's a special nation that God has appointed, it's like the center of salvation history perhaps, and that God has raised up this nation and therefore we need to do something to sort of rescue it or recover it or whatever. But they're still not telling you, what is it about what Christians believe that tells you that you should care? And I think that one of the important things to be getting people to think about is, you go to church and you hear about all these things. You hear about that God made the world. You hear about that sin created a problem. You hear about the fact that Jesus came. You hear about the fact that it's possible for people to be reconciled to God through Jesus. You hear about the Spirit living in people, transforming them. You hear about the fact that God creates a people for himself, the church. You hear about that God's going to wrap it all up in the end, some version of eschatology. There are really ways with almost all those doctrines that you can talk about why politics matters. But can people tell you that? Can they show you why those things that they believe actually either hook onto or actually open doorways into caring about political realities? And so I think one of the things, to me, it's important to say, why should people care about politics? Here's a very low-hanging fruit version of it. God made the world. Yes, things went wrong in the world, but guess what? God did not give up on the world. A lot of times the way the story gets told, it would seem that God has given up on the world, but it's like people only have a kind of flat reading or even not an incomplete reading of what happens when you get Genesis 3 and all the announcement of the curse. Because one of the things that happens with the curse is, childbirth. It's going to get complicated. Working the land. It's going to get complicated. But what it never says is that you're going to get nothing from doing this. It doesn't say, hey, remember all that stuff about reproduction? It's going to just be you guys. Right? No, it's not. No, childbirth's still going to happen. So people are going to, reproduction is going to go on. So that's going to happen, but with complications. Then, when it comes to the participation in the world, the working with the land, and we can probably say, by implication, all the different things that people do in and on God's world, those things are going to have weeds, thorns, thistles that come along with them, but that's not the only thing you're going to get. You're going to get other things that also, you get fruitfulness, actually. You just don't get only fruitfulness when you do it now. And my point being that actually everything that God gave humans to do from the start, they still can do. They just can't still do it without complication. And if that's the case, then what God gave humans to do, which includes, what I was just saying earlier about this social reality as you get more and more people managing this life together, that, whose idea is that? That is not the idea of Satan. That is God's idea. And so it is still given to humans to do this kind of work as part of what it is to be human. And so right there, with just what God wants and intends for creation, gives us the fact of political realities. And if that's the case, then politics is God's idea. And something else that hooks onto that, just in case, somebody goes, yeah, but I'm having a hard time getting past all of this fall and sin stuff. Simple way to think about this. A lot of people, the way that they think about redemption is that redemption is in tension with creation. It's escaping from creation. It's getting you out of it. God's going to blow all this up anyway. And there are a lot of people. In fact, I would wager there are people who come to this conference will hear the this four-story view of the faith, and they'll still leave here having a hard time getting over a view that says there's creation, then everything just went south, and then Jesus rescues us, and then God blows all this up. And then I'm somewhere else. And when God makes a new earth, it's like a new one because he just obliterates this cosmos and says, here's a new one, ladies and gentlemen. So what people are believing when they think about that is strangely a way to think about Jesus that somehow he does not identify with creation. But everybody celebrates Christmas. So what are you talking about Christmas? Why are you celebrating Christmas? Jesus is what? He's born. Oh, wait. Born as what? A human being. In other words, he's identifying with the created order. So it's hard to really take seriously the incarnation and Jesus living that life, dying on the cross, being resurrected in a body, ascending in that body. It's hard to take that seriously and to believe that redemption is in tension with creation rather than reclaiming and transforming creation. And if that's what God is doing, then you can't really get your way out of saying that, well, what God intends for creation at first, it was a nice idea. The fall says we got to go do something else. No, actually, that's getting it wrong if we're taking redemption seriously. And again, I'm just connecting all of that just to the reality of creation. If you take creation seriously, you have to take political life seriously. And then this is the last thing I'll say. If here in the 21st century, you're talking about that in these United States, you are talking about being able to take that reality of creation seriously, that reality of political life seriously, in a context where people have more political agency than most people have had in world history. And for most of world history, people have not gone to elementary school and been told, and one day, boys and girls, maybe one of you could be president of the United States of America, or you could be governor, or you could be a senator, or you could be mayor, etc., etc., etc. This is not what most people have been told about political life for most of world history in most places of the world. But if you're in the United States, you're in a place like that. That is a very unique political reality. And if you are a Christian in that kind of political reality, then the level of agency that you have, even in perhaps certain times of madness, you still have more agency than most people have had. So I just think if we think about that, it's really hard to say when we're thinking about political life that actually that Christian faithfulness means please run for your life from politics. No, I think really it means think about what it's there for. It's not everything, but you have opportunities with what it's there for. And you don't need to think about, if you don't think about politics accomplishing everything, then you don't put the pressure on yourself for politics to be the thing that's bringing about the realization of God's kingdom. That's not the point. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you. So I grew up here in Pittsburgh. I went to North Allegheny School District, which, when I was at NA in the 90s was the best system in the state of Pennsylvania, may still be. And I went to Kenyon College, great liberal arts school. I wanted to be a poet. That was my goal. And Jim ruined my life. No, just kidding. But quite seriously, so my spring semester of my sophomore year was when I met Jim at this conference at Jubilee. And, I was a new believer. I had come to faith right before I went to college. And I really was trying to wrestle with this idea of Christ's lordship over every area of life. That meant something for me as a citizen. And Jim was like the introduction to thinking about this, but it was this place where it just kind of ate at me, that there was this robust set of thoughts on pretty much everything. And I was so glad to have been introduced to CPJ because there was decades of thought work that had been done to answer this question. But then I had another experience. So the fall of my junior year, I had my plan was to go to Exeter in the UK and study poetry in this really prestigious program. But my father died unexpectedly and my mom is disabled, and so I decided I needed to not leave the United States. So because I'm the kind of person I am, I called the president of our college and I basically said, hi, I still want to study off campus. Saw you on the board of this program that sends kids on a service learning thing to an Indian reservation in the Rosebud in South Dakota. Can you get me in? The deadline's over, it's my personality, and he got me in, and off I went to the Rosebud. And, I grew up in a town where, I had had dinner with the mayor as a kid because it was a small enough, little borough up in the North Hills. Things worked well. The government worked well. People might have been on different parties. They didn't scream at each other, kind of thing. And I went to the Rosebud, and I realized that there was just a scale of need that was the actual fault of not good governing, because our federal policies actually trapped people in poverty. I, as a person who had been taught to serve Jesus in these very, tutor kids or backpack buddies or just there was no way that we were going to get people out of 87% unemployment in the town where I lived, because it was structural. It wasn't, the church wasn't doing the church's job, right? The church was doing the church's job, and need and resources were not co-located. Jim taught me that. But also, as a citizen, I actually could do something wearing my citizen hat, thinking about those systems and structures that seem to work great in the North Hills and really bad on the Rosebud. And I just offer that as sort of a micro practical piece, because I think my introduction was not thinking about the monster or maybe the spectacle that we think about when we think about the 2-chapter, kind of like the fall, and then we point to Washington, D.C., right? My introduction was this 4-chapter narrative where it actually stewarded well the political community that we were in, or looked at it critically but hopeful about the reality of what it is supposed to be, and saw that as citizens we bear some responsibility for that if we are people who are serious about loving God and loving our neighbor. And that meant that our hearts would break because the fall is the thistles and thorns. It meant that in my lifetime, right, I don't think a ton has changed on the Rosebud. But it also meant that things could change, and that more of us needed to be people who didn't say, this is all such a mess, I'm out of here, or pox on both your houses, Washington, forget this. But instead we needed to be people who said, Jesus Christ calls us to love our neighbor, and sometimes that's through politics. And that's what it means for us as citizens. So I just offer that as kind of my route to thinking about these things, and what it looks like for the call of our daily lives in the communities that we serve, but also ones that we don't live in, and what that should mean for what we spend our life following that's different than the work of the church in mercy ministry.
Can I follow up on
Please.
something that
Yeah.
Vince said? I think one of the difficulties when you start talking about Christians is that what we have in mind with Christ is the incarnate one who came to save sinners, and that's true. But look again at the way John's gospel introduces the incarnation. Look at Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 and following about who the incarnate one is. Look at the opening verses of Hebrews. They don't introduce the Savior of sinners. They introduce the one in and through whom all things were created. The one in whom all things hang together. No wonder God loves the world so much. This is his. So I would then connect it with the storytelling, that the story that we need to realize is that this is God's story. God's story is he created people to be his dance partner, his children, his family, his bride. Okay, everything that follows from that takes place in that creaturely relationship. It's not creation and then fall and then redemption, like, not that they were saying that, but I mean, that's the way people think. Creation is just the backdrop for getting things started, and then the rest happens, the sin salvation story. Everything takes place in the relationship of God to his creation, in which he's holding it together until he can bring it to fulfillment where the full glory of God is revealed. Now, because that's not the way we Christians, at least I, and I think most of church liturgies too, that tell the sin salvation story, because that's not the way we think, if you look at the American way of thinking about Christ, it is indeed focused on the one who saves souls for eternity. There's more to it than that, because those who are saved should be doing good things for people. But there's a vacuum then that's left. Well, what's the meaning of life in this world? And you know what fills that vacuum, and it has from the beginning of the founding of the country, that this is America is God's chosen nation, the new Israel. That was the language at the founding. That wasn't just preachers preaching it. That was the theme, and it became, that's the basis of our God Bless America. It's the basis of all the things that connect this, and for many Christians, saving America is more important than getting their churches straightened out. Okay, that's, for many evangelicals, as I was aware from you, is a hand in glove. The hand of the salvation of Christ fits the glove of God choosing America to be the chosen nation to bring peace, prosperity, freedom, democracy to the world. The more you look at the Bible and you see that there is only one Israel, and the Messiah of the Israel who comes to bring all nations together, there is no room for another Israel. There's no room for a nation to think of itself in those Israel terms. So the more I look at it, the God bless America, America's founding, God's chosen nation, the rest, it's a heresy. It's actually heretical because it ends up denying the meaning of Christ, the Son of God, in whom all things were created, and who calls Israel to be the light to the world. And Christ comes to fulfill that, all those promises from Abraham on, and will come again to fulfill it all to the glory of God. Now, states, nations fit into that story, just like our farming and our family life and everything else. But they fit into it, they fit into God's story. We are in that story or we're not understanding it. So that was just to follow up on the theme there. And that's why creation's so important, that we not just say, well, it starts with creation as if the creation is just there. It's in and through the Son of God that all things were created and hold together. So it's tied there very much. And then the fact that we've narrowed the story of Jesus in the gospel has left this vacuum open for, well, what's the glue of our life in this world? And all these things that we make as gods, whether it's, through science, we're going to solve all problems, or get rich enough and I'll be okay, or these other gods that we follow, they're gods made out of good things that we ought to be doing, working, serving in different ways. But when they're done properly, then we're not looking for the false gods. We're also see that this whole business, and that's a lot of what the war is about right now. I think there are many, many people whose concern about what's going on now is that the nation that God gave us, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the nation that is created by God, is the thing that's being stolen by the rotten liberal socialists on the left, and we need to recover it. Well, that's not the story that we ought to be thinking about. There are many, many good things about the United States, as my buddy here says. There are many things that are there that we should be good caretakers of and developers of. But this isn't the main story, such that if America loses its place in the world, well, the world's ended. That's kind of the passion that many people have. This is the end of the world. It's not. It's not. The America saving the world for democracy, freedom, and prosperity, and what I'm interested in, is not the story that the biblical. Therefore, if you're thinking like that, I would agree with them. You really ought not to get involved in politics. That's a wrong story. You better get off that train. Get off that train.
So Jim brought up the word heresy. Vince, you've talked a lot about idolatry
Yeah.
and ideology, so
Yeah.
maybe you can say a little bit about this.
It is interesting to think about this. Going back to take another survey of Christians you know and ask this question. Can you count the number of times you've ever heard a sermon about idolatry? I mean, we hear about other things, but how often do you hear about a sermon about naming idols? Right? And of course, not other people's idols, but being willing to ask about the idols that strangely have your address. I think it's important to think about that, because if people are unwilling to do that, it's very interesting for people to say that I care about all these sins. It's like, you do realize the reason why the Israelites went into exile is because God said, hey, you really should lay off the idols. I mean, I told you to avoid them to begin with when you got to the promised land, but you've developed an affinity for, covenantal adultery. And he keeps saying, I'm warning you, and they keep saying, you're so funny. And then, the hoofbeats of the Babylonians, here they come. So my point being is that it is just very interesting how the failure to name idolatry is I think very problematic. I mean, again, if you took a survey of the various Christians you know, different Christian communities that you know, how much is idolatry something that would be discussed? And if for the ones that would say yes, are people willing to say, let the idols be named whatever they are, as opposed to certain idols? I think that's a very, very important question, which of course including making an idol out of these United States. And of course, to go along with the heresy thing you're talking about here, Jim, it is, I know it's being recorded, but hey, it's strangely, well, I'll use the word hilarious, that anyone thinks that a country this side of the Atlantic is the center of salvation history because the Bible doesn't mention anything that's over here. So unless you have some idea that there's some verse somewhere that says, well, this is really talking about the United States right here in the first century or earlier, but mentioning the United States, it really takes a lot to believe that. And again, and I've said elsewhere, I'm fine talking about American exceptionalism. There's a lot of things that are very distinctive about this country. But American exceptionalism does not equate to being anything like some chosen nation. Never mind the fact that even with the good things of the country that Jim also did mention, this country has never delivered on those things. It has never delivered on those things especially when most of its history included by law, making sure that not everybody who was here actually got to participate fully in the country. That's most of the history of the country. So it's a strange thing to think of yourself as a chosen people when you violate neighbor love by law, and people think that that's just the way things are supposed to be. So all those things, I think, complicate the idea of a kind of favored nation status. Exceptionalism doesn't have to mean favored nation, but I think shifting the narrative is a big challenge. I think I saw a hand back there saying something.
Yeah, it's our 5-minute warning hand.
Really?
Yeah, man.
I didn't see it.
Really?
Yeah, straight up.
Wow.
Okay, so we're going to use our 5 minutes very judiciously. Lest we stay in despair, can we talk for a minute about what does citizenship shaped by public justice look like? And maybe say something praiseworthy, not lamentable.
Well, I think what I think more about is think of the early Christians who weren't trying to save the Roman Empire. Their lives didn't depend on whether the emperor that's there is not going to kill them or not. They just went ahead and lived as Christians, and pretty soon they're taking in lepers, they're treating women like real humans, they're not throwing their babies away, and it becomes known for the way they live. And Vince already mentioned, you go through most of the world, much of it today, in which people live in poverty. They don't have governments that are decent, many of them. They don't have opportunity. So the way I would say is we Christians have been, in America, we have been blessed so richly, not just with the things of this age and our capabilities, responsibilities, but showered with opportunities to hear the gospel. And one of the big problems is that people see us living, including the way we do our politics and the way we do our discriminating, that it's a blasphemy, to God. So let's read the first chapter of Isaiah. God's sick and tired. He doesn't want to hear their prayers anymore. He didn't want to smell the incense. Let's talk about what you're doing. Seek justice, do this and that. So, but from that point of view, what I'm saying is, even if we begin to do little things, which in this country might seem very small, to try to build a community with a different approach to politics, in which we know we're going to have slings and arrows thrown at us. If you haven't read or know about Russell Moore, who was the head of
ERLC.
what was it?
The Ethics
Faith and
Ethics and Religious Liberty
of the Southern
Commission.
Baptists. He started bringing up things about racism, about all kinds of things that encourage the Christians to be repenting of our own sins and then getting on. He was eventually thrown out of that. You should be reading book, the latest one by this Tim Alberta. You might have heard an interview with him. He has this book, the latest one, forget how it starts, but in the kingdom and the power and the glory. Mm-hmm. It has something to do with the American. Mm-hmm. This guy's a really, really brilliant insight as an evangelical and grew up in an evangelical home, and how he began to see and discern what was problematic with that. And he's really getting deep insights into both what I call the civil religious aspect, but also into what it is. We're having an increasing number of some really outstanding people. David Brooks, who writes for the New York Times, often has great wisdom and insight, a fairly new Christian. But people like this, there are an increasing number of people that we have to, given all the problems and injustices in Alabama, we have two great Pulitzer Prize winning columnists in the newspaper who are exposing injustice all the time. They're going after it. There's an increasing number of these kind of people that God is blessing us with, that are articulating, leading the way to give us things not only to enrich ourselves, to learn better, but then to be spokespeople for us. And so I think rather than thinking we're coming out of poverty or think that the biggest thing is the crisis of America, maybe losing its number one place in the world to China or something, we ought to say, look, we need to gather all the, pray for missionaries to come over here from Korea and elsewhere to mission to us about what it means to live as Christians in dire circumstances. We need to get over this thing that we are the ones that have everything to be known and we're going to ship it out. It's an old mentality, but it's there. So I'm only saying, I think that the joy of coming together, when you're together with your staff at the center, when people come together at a Jubilee conference and you're celebrating, you're getting excited about the vision, you're remembering things you learned, and you're finding old friends. That's what we ought to be living about all the time as Christians, finding the way to nurture the community. And I would say the civic community, if people began seeing large groups of us, large groups of 10 and 15, trying to pursue justice in the public square, well, it would knock them off their feet.
I would say it's very easy to be cynical about all the polarization right now, but I think it's important to think about the fact that politics is not only national, that that phrase "all politics is local," and to be thinking about what else is going on locally, what else can I find that's going on where I can discover maybe one particular public concern. And to think about, okay, is there something in my town? Is there something in my county? Is there something in my state where I can begin to pay attention to that? Because all politics is not just about certain national issues where people are making a name for themselves by being outrageous. There's a lot of other things that are going on. And if we keep in mind the fact that most politics is very mundane and unsexy, there are a lot of mundane and unsexy things that need people's attention. And so I think that, there's the possibility with all this agency to actually think about, all right, what's something I can identify and that I can care about and seek not to make it perfect, but to bring some kind of penultimate good to that situation, at least by lending my voice to it, if not in some other way of being involved in, the development of policy itself. Those are real possibilities that we have. So I think putting up that kind of antenna rather than just having our antenna be about all the things that make the news. The news is incentivized by, dollars follow negativity. Well, but negativity isn't the only thing. There's a lot of possibilities for doing small good things. So I think looking for those things and those kinds of opportunities is something that I would encourage.
I think I would just add two things. First, within this kind of bigger story, right? So not just the fall and Jesus, there is so much hope. And I think that is a thing that we don't experience at all when we think about politics right now. And I would just invite you to kind of reframe you're thinking about what it means to be in a political community as a citizen, to think about it in that 4-chapter story. The other piece is, I think for a lot of us who find a lot of things about our current politics, our political climate, to be quite lamentable, that it can also feel really overwhelming to do what Vince just said. Like, in the sense of how in the world do I start down a path where I'm going to learn about this? So, shameless promo, CPJ can help. We're happy to do plenty of education if you like to read. I'm going to put a book list up here in a second, But also, Jim has this wonderful thing in a book called The Good of Politics, which is kind of like the introduction to this set of thinking, where he talks about the body of Christ, right? And this is one of those places where, because we vote in secret, we think about ourselves as citizens as solos. Like the actual liturgy of voting, which is good, free and fair elections, it protects us from undue influence, all that, has actually formed us to think about this as we're on a solo, when we're not at all on a solo, right? We're part of a body of Christians, actually globally, who are working for public justice, for this just public order, right? And so if we can also reframe ourselves to think about that, it becomes a little less anxiety producing, because you're not thinking, oh my goodness, now I have to become an expert on tax policy and systemic injustice on an Indian reservation, et cetera, et cetera. So I would just offer that as a place for hope as well in the context of the talk.
Amen.
All right. The book list. Okay, so if you want a 5-minute read, this QR code is to a wonderful piece written by our brother Vince, Hope for the Politically Homeless. And we can flip back through these slides if your phone didn't get it quite fast enough. If you want 2-hour reads, all these books are over on the book table that Byron has. There's a book, The Political Disciple, Theology of Public Life, that Vince wrote, and Unleashing Opportunity, which I had a lot of fun writing with the late Mike Gerson, Washington Post columnist, and a wonderful young woman who worked for us, Katie Thompson. Then get a little bit more theology here within the context of this CFRC kind of vision. When the Kings Come Marching In by our friend Rich Mao, former president of Fuller Seminary. It's another 2-hour read over there. The Good of Politics is going to take you longer than 2 hours, I promise you, but it's totally worth it. And this is wonderful introduction by Jim. Really into kind of, if you want to try this set of glasses on a little bit more, you can do that with this book. Jim has in front of him God's Sabbath with Creation. And so the piece where he said, like, creation's not the prelude to the real story. This book is a wonderful gift.
There are flyers up here
yes.
about that book.
And that book's over across the way as well. This is
I'll pass 'em out.
comprehensive. Yeah, this is comprehensive, it's theological, it's a wonderful Sabbath reading, a chapter at a time, but really, thinking about this larger vision. And then if you want to go like really deep on like the comparative political theology and all the thinking on, there's a wonderful book by our friend David Koyzis, Political Visions and Illusions, and this is a survey and Christian critique of contemporary ideologies. This is a textbook level, but it is also just a treasure that we could encourage you to do. So thank you to my colleagues. We're so grateful for you, and thanks for being here.